In the autumn of 1957, a small firm from Milan won 2 world championships in a single season. Weeks later, it announced that it would never race again. It was not bankrupt. It was not beaten. It was, by every measure that a racing team is judged by, winning. And it walked away from the sport at the very top, leaving its rivals to fight over the ground it had chosen to abandon. The firm was called Mondial. Its full name was FB Mondial, and the 2 letters stood for Fratelli Boselli, the Boselli brothers, a family from northern Italy, whose factory had never been built to chase trophies at all. And the strange thing about their story is not the day they quit. The real story of Mondial is a tiny 4-stroke engine, no larger than a bag of sugar, with 2 camshafts sitting on top of a single cylinder. A machine so good that it beat everyone in its class for years, and then crossed the entire world to help build the empire that would replace it. This is the story of a company that reached the summit of Grand Prix racing, looked around and decided that the view was as far as it wished to go. The story begins not with a racing motorcycle, but with a delivery van. In the years before the Second World War, the Boselli family ran a business under the initials FB, and what they made were 3-wheeled commercial vehicles, small motorized carts of the kind that carried crates of vegetables and barrels and building materials through the narrow streets of Italian towns. It was honest, unglamorous work. A 3-wheeled cart does not need to be beautiful, and it does not need to be fast. It needs to start on a cold morning and carry a heavy load without complaint. That was the world the Boselli name came from. To understand why that mattered, consider Italy in the years just after the war. The country was poor, damaged, and desperate to move again. Roads that had carried tanks now needed to carry workers and bread and building stone. Almost no ordinary family could afford a car. What Italy needed more than anything was cheap, light, reliable transport, and out of that need came a whole golden age of small machines, the little scooters and lightweight motorcycles that put a shattered nation back on wheels. It was a world built around modest engines doing honest work, and the Boselli firm with its 3-wheeled carts sat comfortably in the middle of it. Nothing about that world suggested that the same family was about to build the finest small racing engine on the planet. The man who would change that world was Count Giuseppe Boselli. He was an aristocrat, a man of some means, and he carried the one quality that turns a quiet family firm into a legend, and just as often turns a fortune into dust. He loved racing, not as a business, not as advertising, but for its own sake. And after the war, when Italy was rebuilding itself out of rubble and hunger, and needed cheap transport more than it needed champions, Count Boselli became interested in something that had nothing to do with delivery carts. He became interested in small engines, very small engines built to an extraordinary standard. In the early part of 1948, Boselli acquired a prototype. It had been designed by a young engineer named Alfonso Drusiani, the son of another engineer, and it was on paper a piece of quiet madness. It was a single-cylinder, 4-stroke engine of just 123 cubic centimeters. That is a very small engine, the sort of displacement that in those years powered mopeds and lightweight commuter bikes. But Drusiani had not built a commuter engine. On top of that single small cylinder, he had placed not 1 camshaft, but 2. To understand why that mattered, it helps to understand what almost every other small racing engine of that era looked like. In the 125 cubic centimeter class, the class for the smallest machines, nearly everyone used a 2-stroke engine. A 2-stroke is simple. It fires on every turn of the crankshaft. It has few moving parts. It is cheap to build and easy to tune. And in a small engine, it can make good power for its size. For anyone building a racing motorcycle in the smallest class in 1948, the sensible, obvious, proven choice was a 2-stroke. Drusiani ignored the sensible choice completely. A 4-stroke engine fires only once every 2 turns of the crankshaft. It is more complicated. It has valves, it has camshafts to open those valves. It has a whole mechanism that the 2-stroke does without. And the reason to accept all that complication is control. The great enemy of a small racing engine is engine speed. To make power from very little displacement, the engine has to spin extremely fast, tens of thousands of revolutions, and at those speeds the valves must open and snap shut with perfect timing, many times every second. A single camshaft driving the valves through long rods and rockers begins to lose that precision. The parts flex. The timing smears, the engine chokes on its own breathing. 2 overhead camshafts, sitting directly above the valves, solve that problem. Each camshaft acts on its valves with almost no mechanism in between. The valves obey, and so the engine can be revved higher and breathe cleaner and hold its power exactly where a racing engine needs it, at the screaming top of its range, precisely where a simple two-stroke begins to fall apart. Drusiani had looked at the cheap, easy, popular answer and had built the difficult, expensive, brilliant one instead, on a machine the size of a bicycle. There was a craftsmanship to it that went beyond the choice of layout. Driving two camshafts at the top of a cylinder is not a simple thing. The power to turn them has to travel all the way up from the crankshaft at the bottom of the engine, and it has to arrive with absolute precision, because a camshaft that is even slightly out of time will open its valves at the wrong instant and wreck the engine. Drusiani solved this with a delicate train of gears running up the side of the cylinder, a little tower of finely cut teeth carrying the drive upward, and dividing it neatly between the two shafts. It was the kind of work that could only be done by hand, by men who understood metal, and it was expensive in exactly the way that a delivery cart is not. Every one of these engines was, in a sense, a small piece of jewelry that happened to make horsepower. Count Boselli understood what he was holding. He took Drusiani's engine, wrapped a proper racing motorcycle around it, and in 1948 Mondial went racing. What happened next does not sound believable when it is written down plainly. In 1949, the sport of motorcycle racing organized itself into a true world championship for the first time, a series of Grand Prix races across Europe, with a champion crowned at the end in each class. It was the founding season of the championship that continues, in a direct line to this very day. And in the smallest class, the 125, the first world champion in history was a Mondial rider. His name was Nello Pagani. He won every one of the championship races that counted that season. Mondial did not merely win the first small-class world title, it was named the top manufacturer in the world, in its first full year of racing. With an engine everyone else had told it not to build, that could have been a single golden season, the kind of lucky year that a small firm never repeats. It was not. The next year, 1950, the 125 World Championship went to Mondial again, this time with the rider Bruno Ruffo, and the year after that, 1951, it went to Mondial a third time, with a young rider named Carlo Ubbiali, who would go on to become one of the greatest small-capacity racers who ever lived. 3 world championships in a row. And across those 3 seasons, the little twin-camshaft Mondials did not just win the titles. They won race after race with a completeness that bordered on the absurd, filling the results sheets so thoroughly that there was often very little left for anyone else. The effect on the rest of the sport was profound. The rivals who had gone racing with sensible two-stroke engines, proud names like MV Agusta and Moto Marini, watched a 123 cubic centimeter four-stroke beat them into the ground, and they drew the only conclusion they could. They abandoned their two-strokes. They began building four-strokes of their own, chasing the design that Drusiani had been brave enough, or stubborn enough, to build first. A small firm from Milan, better known for delivery carts, had just rewritten the rulebook for an entire class of racing. By the middle of the 1950s, that rulebook had made the class fierce. The rivals had caught up. MV Agusta in particular, backed by the wealth and iron will of Count Domenico Augusta, was turning Grand Prix racing into a battlefield of money and engineering. To stay at the front, Mondial pushed on. Drusiani grew his design upward, building a larger twin-camshaft single of 250 cubic centimeters. A beautiful and formidable machine in its own right. And in 1957, Mondial reached its second summit, higher than the first. That season, the 125 World Championship was won by a Mondial rider, Tarquinio Provini, one of the finest talents of his generation, a small, fierce competitor who would spend the coming years locked in some of the most famous duels the sport had ever seen. And the 250 World Championship, in the same year, was won by another Mondial rider, the Englishman Cecil Sanford. Sanford was no newcomer to glory. He had already been a world champion once before, years earlier, one of the first British riders ever to win a motorcycle world title, and now on a Mondial, he added a second crown in a heavier class. He took it almost at a canter, winning the race on the Isle of Man and the race in Ulster and standing on the podium again and again. These were not lucky men handed fast machines. They were among the very best in the world, and the fact that Mondial could put them on the top step in 2 different classes at once said everything about how good the little factory had become. 2 riders, 2 world championships. in 2 different classes, in one single season, for a firm whose entire racing history was less than 10 years old. And that is the moment to stop and look, because everything that came before was the climb, and everything that follows is the fall. Except that this was a fall no one saw coming, because it did not begin with a crash or a bankruptcy or a defeat. It began with a decision made in an office by men who were winning. On the 15th of September 1957, at the height of that double championship season, the racing world was stunned by an announcement. Mondial was withdrawing from Grand Prix racing, and it was not withdrawing alone. It made the announcement together with 2 other great Italian names, Moto Guzzi and Gilera, each of which had also just won a world championship that very year. Guzzi in the 350 class and Gilera in the 500. 3 of the reigning world champions of 1957 were leaving the sport at the same time, by agreement on the same day. The reasons were not glory but arithmetic. Grand Prix racing had become ruinously expensive, an arms race of exotic engines that devoured money at a frightening rate. When Mondial had first gone racing in 1948, a clever engine designed by one gifted man could win a world championship. By 1957, that was no longer true. The competition now had multi-cylinder engines of bewildering complexity, whole engineering departments, wind and weight obsessions, and budgets that a family firm making mopeds could not hope to match year after year. Winning had stopped being a matter of brilliance and had become a matter of spending, and spending on that scale for a company Mondial's size was a slow act of self-destruction, and at the same time the sales that were supposed to justify all that spending were drying up. Italy was growing wealthier, and the ordinary Italian who had once bought a small motorcycle to get to work was now beginning to want a small car instead. The market that racing was meant to advertise was quietly shrinking underneath it, and over all of it hung a darker fact that the men who ran these companies could not ignore. Riders were dying. The sport in that era killed with a regularity that is difficult to comprehend now, and the cost of victory was being paid in lives as well as money. So the great Italian firms did something almost unheard of in the history of competition. They agreed together to simply stop, to walk away while they were ahead, and to spend their money on building motorcycles that people would actually buy. It was a coldly rational decision, and it was announced so abruptly that many of the riders whose careers depended on these teams found out that their factories had quit racing, not from the factories themselves, but by reading it in the newspaper. There was one name that had been part of the discussions and then, at the last moment, refused to sign. MV Agusta stayed. Count Agusta kept his team on the track, and in the years that followed, MV Agusta went on to win championship after championship after championship, an almost unbroken reign, collecting all the glory that Mondial and Guzzi and Gilera had chosen to leave lying on the ground. The company that walked away had to watch from the sidelines as the one company that stayed became a legend on the very stage it had abandoned. But the engine had one more journey left in it, and it is the strangest and most beautiful part of the whole story. In that same period at the end of the 1950s, a manufacturer on the other side of the world was studying how to go Grand Prix racing. It was a young Japanese company, ambitious far beyond its size, run by a determined engineer named Soichiro Honda. Honda wanted to race, and to race he needed to understand what the best small racing engines in the world were actually made of. So he did something direct. He approached Count Boselli, the owner of the firm that had just won both small-class world titles, and he asked to buy a Mondial racing motorcycle. Boselli, whose team no longer had any use for its racing machines, gave him one. A twin-camshaft Mondial Grand Prix racer was crated up and shipped to Japan, arriving in the autumn of 1958. And Honda's engineers took that small Italian engine, the culmination of everything Drusiani had learned, and they studied it, and they measured it, and they used it as one of the starting points for the design of Honda's very first Grand Prix motorcycle, the racer it called the RC142. That machine was the seed of everything that came after. Within a decade, Honda would be the most successful Grand Prix manufacturer on Earth, and Japanese motorcycles would come to dominate the sport so completely that the old European names would become memories. The engine that Mondial walked away from did not die. It emigrated. It taught its secrets to the very company that would go on to conquer the world that Mondial had ruled and then renounced. And to this day, when a visitor walks into the great museum that Honda built to house its own history, the Honda Collection Hall, the first motorcycle they see standing at the head of the line, before all the Hondas, before all the glory, is a small red Italian racer, a Mondial, the machine that started it all, honored by the empire it helped create. As for the company itself, its ending was quiet, the way most endings actually are. Without racing to carry its name, Mondial went back to building ordinary machines, small motorcycles and mopeds for a market that cared less and less. Sales fell through the 1960s and kept falling through the 1970s. There were no scandals and no dramatic collapse, only a slow fading of a name that had once meant the fastest small motorcycles in the world. By the end of the 1970s, the firm founded by the Boselli brothers had ceased to make motorcycles at all. And so the question hangs, unanswered, over the whole story. Was it wisdom, or was it pride? Count Boselli and the men beside him looked at the peak of the mountain, at 2 world championships won in a single season, and decided that there was nothing left up there worth dying and going bankrupt for. They chose to leave undefeated. It is possible that they were exactly right, that a graceful exit at the summit is a rarer and finer thing than one more trophy. It is also possible that a company that stops competing has already begun to die, and that the slow fade of the following decades was written into that single proud decision made on a September afternoon. The firm that walked away is gone, but the engine it walked away from is not. It stands first in line, polished and lit, in a museum built on the other side of the world by the men it once beat. A small 4-stroke with 2 camshafts, built against all advice by a company that reached the top of the sport, and then while it was still winning, quietly closed the door and turned out the light. If these are the stories worth staying for, the ones about the machines and the people the history books tend to forget, then there are more of them coming, and a like or a subscription helps them find their way to the people who would want them. The next one is about an engine whose name almost no one knows, and yet which has quietly powered